It's 1993, Jurassic Park is in the cinemas, Bill Clinton has just been inaugurated as US President, and Fiat launched the Coupe. In the past, I've argued that the 90s was a period of renaissance for Fiat, a time of expanded creativity where they started to make really interesting cars once again. The Barchetta, the GTV, the 145, the Multipla, they were all cars that were markedly different from their competitors, but none more so than the Coupe. As a second series coupe, this also used what was then Fiat's brand new 5-cylinder 20-valve engine. Now this was used in their lineup for a remarkably short period of time, 1996 to 2001, and it was then binned. Today, I want to work out why. I also want to explore the case that although brave, this wasn't a golden era for Fiat at all. That in fact, this bold range of products accelerated Fiat's slow decline. Before we talk more generally about the coupe, there's two things that I want to point out to you. Firstly, it's the beauty of that key. My God, who spends that amount of money making a key which is just such a delight? It feels amazing in your hand, just the weighing of it, the way it looks, the way it feels, fabulous. The fuel filler on the Fiat Coupe as well was just a little bit of madness from Fiat. But also a tiny detail, but one that I love, is that obviously the colours were a big thing on these cars and the interior reflects the exterior colour, but also the badges on the side of the car where you have the 20 valve, the little strike, the little underline that goes underneath it also mirrors the colour of the car. They could have just done it black, but no. If you've got a yellow one, the little flash is yellow. On this one, it's the same colour. It's that sort of metallic burgundy. I just love that they did all that. So the design, what do we think of it? When it first came out, I was really a little bit unsure about it, and I went from thinking it was maybe a little bit ugly to eventually really loving it, especially when the later versions came out with the bigger and slightly more delicate looking alloy wheels. And I think I just admired the fact that it was so different. But I was talking earlier to the owner, Andrew, who obviously adores his car, but even he will freely admit that from some angles it is just plain ugly. And I think that you can't deny that. I mean, if you look at it from the front, I quite like it, and those sort of headlights with the little bulges on them, I really like. I like the Ferrari nod rear end, the way the lights are there. But again, going back to the back end of the car, the way that is so suddenly sort of truncated means that from the back and from the rear three quarters, it just, to me, it doesn't look right. The proportions aren't quite right on it either. So, did Fiat make a mistake being so bold with this car and making something which is just so different from anything else out there? Pininfarina's own design suggestion for this eventually became the Peugeot 406 Coupe. A very, very beautiful car. Now, would they have been better off maybe using that rather than going in such a crazy direction? I don't know. What do you think about that? Now, it is so odd that a company would go to the lengths of designing a brand new 5-cylinder engine and then only use it in one generation of car for 5 years. So maybe, is there something inherently wrong with that engine? Let's see how this one goes down the road. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. 150 horsepower on this. I think one of the later, slightly later revisions maybe got 155, but it feels very nippy. It's also a smooth engine, and it has that 5-cylinder warble, which makes it feel definitely above a 4-cylinder. Now, there are many ways in which the 5-cylinder is superior to a 4 and has advantages over a 6 as well. it's inherently smoother than a 4. So a 5-cylinder is 25% smoother than a 4-cylinder. It's to do with the firing order. A 6-cylinder, an inline 6, by contrast, is only 20% smoother than a 5. So you get much more of a gain for less put in comparatively. In terms of packaging as well, you don't have the problems of having the inline 6, which can't be transversely mounted. Now, for a few years, they had problems running 5s because of the intake lengths. It meant that until fuel injection came in, they couldn't really be used as a production engine, let's say. Audi were the first to do it. That's because they wanted to squeeze it into that car with the transverse engine. But that also had injection. By this point in time, they had it pretty well refined. And this was an engine which has its own distinct character. It pulls very well, it goes very well. It doesn't quite have the upward quality perhaps of a 6-cylinder, but initially, to me, I was shocked. When this engine first came out, I was looking forward to it being developed and being in a whole series of Fiat cars. I think the last one it was in, which was sort of a fairly more of a common car, was the Punto. The HGT had this engine. That stopped being made in 2001. Incidentally, that's a car I'd really love to review if you have one. They are so rare. Not a Punto HGT, sorry, the Bravo HGT. But anyway, after that, it sort of pretty much disappeared, and yet it doesn't seem to be that there's anything particularly wrong with this engine. So why did this happen? I think there's two reasons. The first thing you have to realize is that this was part of a new series of modular engines built at Prato la Serra. So this is the town in Italy where these were built, and it was anything from an inline 4 1.4 to a 2.4 diesel inline 5 and 4 cylinders, to these, the 20 valve 5-cylinder, even the turbo. So it was a whole series of engines that with modular design. It meant that when they dropped the engine, it wasn't the same as the 70s or the 80s that you're designing a specific engine, putting all that development into it, and if you're going to drop it, it's going to be a big, big cost. With this, because it was modular, they just kind of, dropping it as an engine didn't have the same cost ramifications. Also, things changed. By the 2000s, the emphasis had changed a lot into emissions and fuel consumption, and at the same time 4-cylinder engines had improved. They'd become smoother, they'd become better, and the advantage of having a 5-cylinder had really narrowed to not very much. As a result, this engine was really replaced by the much smaller 1.4 multi-air. In turbo application, that would be more efficient. It's pretty much just as smooth, and it worked much better in terms of producing the power outputs that were needed. Now, it's not like Fiat completely ceased to make any of the bigger engines at all, but on the whole, keeping the 5-cylinder just didn't seem to make sense. And that really is a shame, because it's such a characterful and distinctive engine. Now today it's quite a slippery road out here, and he had a little bit of wheel spin there in first gear. This car has the smaller wheels actually, which are from the first version. Both the turbo and the normally aspirated cars then had the same wheels. I do prefer the later ones, bigger, more delicate, but there are some other differences between this and the turbo. I test drove a turbo a few years back, and I thought that perhaps the 20 valve engine, a little bit of understeer there, but very manageable. Oh, more understeer, less manageable there. But going back to the turbo and so on, it's got such a wodge of torque, that car, that although it's quite well managed, quite well controlled, it's got limited slip diff, which keeps things under check. I thought that perhaps the normally aspirated version might be a better drive, because you'd be able to use a little bit more finesse with it and, be able to meter out the power a little bit more and lean on the chassis in a more constructive way. But found out only today, there is one thing that changes things. The turbo had a quicker steering lack, 2-point turns lock to lock, which even the journos that tested it at the time really absolutely loved. Unfortunately, for the naturally aspirated car like this one, they kept the slower rack, so that's 3 turns lock to lock. Having driven it today, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it still drives pretty well. I'm not feeling like the steering is unnecessarily slow, but I think it would have given it a sense of liveness and a sense of agility that is perhaps a little bit more lacking in this car. Now, the chassis for this, although derived from the hatchback, from the Tipo that Fiat were making at the time, it has fully independent suspension, so struts at the front, semi-trailing arms at the rear. And it works pretty well. The car rides well, it's comfortable, it's a good mixture of practicality while still being reasonably sporty. The gear change, it's got a tiny bit of notchiness in it, but it's very easy to use. You know, interior-wise, I think it's stunning. If you look at other car interiors for this time, this was just head and shoulders above anything else. The quality isn't too bad either. I mean, this car has 150,000 miles on it, and yet there aren't any squeaks or rattles in here. Everything has survived pretty well. There is only the telltale 90s rubber covering which detracts a little bit from it. Otherwise, it really looks like it's done pretty well. And I think quality overall wasn't bad on these cars, but maybe it wasn't quite good enough. So you have the fact that it's such an oddball car, and then you ally that with Fiat having such a humdrum reputation when it came to reliability and quality. And I think it's the latter that played the biggest role. I think if they played it safe maybe, and made something that was more universally acceptable to people, perhaps they would have seen more sales. But I think what really hurt it wasn't the boldness of their designs. It was more to do with, whether it was true or not, with how reliable and lacking in quality people perceived Fiat to be. Now at this time, you can look at the Multipla. Everybody who has owned one of those cars says they are absolutely amazing. But Fiat went all out and made it look, frankly, quite bonkers. I don't mind the design, but a lot of people absolutely hate it. Now that is an example where I think maybe had they gone for something more conventional, they could have leveraged the fact that it was really good, very usable, so practical, but also sold it to people who didn't buy something which was so out there. So does the same apply to the Coupe? Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you very much to Andrew for bringing down the Coupe. It has been a lot of fun driving this today and getting reacquainted with one of these greats, exploring what happened to the 5-cylinder engine as well. Thank you all for watching, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video.